The Magicka Templar is hands down one of the most exhilarating and unstoppable classes that you can play in the Elder Scrolls Online. With its game-changing execute, Radiant Oppression, Templars are so effective that teams often stack them just to make tough executes faster and easier. In any dungeon or trial, the Templar turns every battle into a swift, overwhelming victory. This video is designed to be a complete and comprehensive guide to help you find the build that works best for you and to teach you how to optimize your Templar for all encounter types. It covers the class fundamentals, how it works, and how to maximize your damage with your specific build, both on the dummy and in content. Beginners should start right here, where we discuss how to build the class, while more experienced players can dive into the damage dealing section, which covers class fundamentals, rotations, and adapting the rotations for real scenarios. Check the description for resources, timestamps, and easy navigation to specific topics, and be sure to join the Discord to get access to the written guide that has over 40 pages of information. We have a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. Getting into the basic build information for the patch, appearing now is a graphic that outlines all of the miscellaneous build info that we'll discuss in this section for the sake of your own ease. I provide alternatives to each of these best in slot options as the section progresses. So with that, starting with our race options, both Dark Elf and High Elf are the absolute strongest choices that we have, with each giving a near identical DPS output. The only difference is that High Elf gives 100 more max mag overall, and Dark Elf gives a ton of max stam. Otherwise, the stat bonuses are the same. This makes my personal go-to Dark Elf, as this will allow your character to be versatile and have the ability to switch between mag and stam specs effectively. That said though, High Elf does offer some sustain help, and this becomes very necessary to sustain on the dummy, and even in some content. So if you're sticking to mag, you'll want to go with High Elf. Race plays a very small role in total DPS output though, so if you prefer, Orc is the next best option, giving the same amount of weapon and spell damage with no max resources, but it does offer some passive healing to assist with better survivability. Finally, in solo 4-man or even unorganized 12-man content, Khajiit can end up being the strongest choice as it offers some crit damage, a stat that's not necessary when your group is optimized in 12-man, but the most important stat to make sure that you have enough of. Wood Elf is conceptually the same, but in regards to penetration. You want 125% crit damage and 18,200 penetration in 12-man content to maximize your damage potential. Stats that you can't really track in your character sheet, but more so that you should consider by knowing which buffs and debuffs are being provided by your support. For our Mundus in 99% of situations, the Thief will be the strongest option, giving a ton of critical chance, an essential and particularly difficult stat to source. In very rare situations, you might consider running either the Lover or the Shadow. The Lover offers some penetration to help you hit that 18,200 cap, and the Shadow is particularly good when running Mechanical Acuity, since this set will get your crit chance to 100% anyway. As a final option, a Mundus that is slowly working its way into the meta when running Highland Sentinel is the Apprentice. Since our crit chance is so high with this set, we will actually get a slightly higher damage ceiling, which just means damage potential with this Mundus that gives weapon and spell damage. This isn't currently being used outside of dummy parsing for bow setups to my knowledge, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure. For our attributes, we are dumping all 64 points into mag. It shouldn't be necessary for the sake of sustain or survivability in content to allocate these anywhere else, so we'll take the highest damage gain that we can by making our mag pool as high as possible. For our consumables, we have plenty of situational options to consider. In most content situations, we will opt to use any CP 150, mag, and health blue buy stat food options, which offer over 5k health and nearly 5k max magicka. These food choices give us nearly as much max mag as any other food alternative, but also offer a ton of health, making it our go-to in content for the sake of maximizing both damage and survivability. That said though, if you're interested in high risk, high reward damage, Green Max Mag food will give you the highest damage increase out of any food or drink option, offering over 6k max mag. This is the food that we use on the dummy. These options only work though if you can sustain them, and sadly the Templar's sustain is one of the worst in the game, making an option that gives recovery extremely helpful. Our go-to for this is Ghastly Eyeball, which offers the highest max mag and mag recovery combo out of any other food or drink choices. The only problem with this choice is that it offers no max health, so in content you may find that your survivability is too low. If this is the case, you could consider using Clockwork Citrus Fillet in its place, a food choice that offers the least amount of damage compared to the previously mentioned options, but gives max health, max mag, and some mag recovery. Clockwork is the perfect middle ground when balancing damage, sustain, and survivability. As a note, we will likely be able to solve sustain issues with the skill Channeled Focus, which we will discuss later, but slotting a skill like this will result in the damage loss, so we try to avoid doing that and attempt to solve this problem first with our consumables when possible. For our potions this patch, we will be opting to run heroism pots. Normally, we ensure that our major prophecy and sorcery buffs are sourced through our potions, but the Templar is a bit of a unique class in the sense that we can get one of these buffs with a skill. One of our class skills, Vampire's Bane, provides major prophecy, so instead of doubling up on this buff with the typical Alliance spell power potions, we can source the prophecy with Vampire's Bane and the sorcery with the guild skill Degeneration. This allows us to run heroism pots, which restore both mag and stam, give the major mag and stam recovery buffs, which increase both recovery pools by 30%, and offer minor heroism, which speeds up our ult gen. The main damage increase on the dummy is seen with these potions because they allow our shooting star to perfectly line up with the consistent off-balance procs that we get on the dummy, a damage amplifier when running the Exploiter's CP. This is pretty much a free 2 to 3k extra DPS when performing the rotation correctly. The benefit in content is a bit more obvious. Oftentimes when using heroism potions, we can get an extra ultimate in a fight where we might not otherwise. You can craft these by combining Dragon Room, Dragon's Blood, and Columbine. Once we get within beam threshold though, the sweaty thing to do is to stop casting Vampire's Bane and Degen for the sake of more beams. But we need to source these buffs from somewhere. Cue our next option, the Alliance Spell Power or Essence of Spell Power potions. Swapping from ult pots to spell power potions at around 40% will allow you to stop casting the aforementioned skills and still maintain the extremely important buffs. Likewise, heroism potions can be extremely expensive to craft, so if you don't want to bother with the cost, you can just run these instead for the entire parse with minimal damage loss. You can craft Essence of Spell Power by combining Cornflower, Lady Smock, and Water Hyacinth, or purchase the Alliance Spell Draft from Cyrodiil. Finally, one of the benefits of running ulti pots is not only the damage buff, but the fact that they restore mag and stam. If you're finding stam sustain to be an issue for whatever reason, you can opt to use simple tripots over the spell damage ones to solve your problem, at a price far cheaper than ulti pots. You can craft these by combining Bugloss, Columbine, and Mountain Flower. For our champion points this patch, we will be opting to run Deadly Aim, Thaumaturge, Wrathful Strikes, and Exploiter. Exploiter provides the strongest damage increase out of any CP option, but has some tough conditions to make it worthwhile. Keeping the highest possible uptime on off-balance for Exploiter isn't always the best way to use it. For example, on Chimera, the second boss in Sanity's Edge, proccing off-balance while everyone is going out of group to place meteors is a wasted proc, since everybody may not be able to hit the boss during this mechanic. Wasting Exploiter procs makes running other alternative CP more worthwhile. In addition to this, DDs need to somewhat track Exploiter to maximize damage with this CP, which is nearly impossible to do on console because tracking the cooldown requires all buffs to be turned on. This makes it incredibly difficult to spot the single icon that you need to locate among the masses. For most players, it will be worth simply dropping this CP in content. Exploiter shines though in trash pulls when skills like Scythe on a Crow are being used to provide AoE off balance instantly. In short pulls, you end up getting all of the benefits of Exploiter without the hindrances of uptimes or brain power to worry about. Our next option, Thaumaturge, is the most important CP that we slot, as it will buff Radiant Oppression as well as most of our abilities in general, including the dots from Trap, Stampede, Carve, Degen, Ritual, and Vampire's Bane. Deadly Aim is the next strongest CP that we can use, as this will buff a few of our heaviest hitting abilities, which will mainly be Radiant Oppression and Power of the Light. In fact, these two skills alone make up about 30% of our overall DPS output. Now, a good rule of thumb in general is that running anything that buffs Radiant Oppression is almost always worthwhile, especially in content. Finally, since the vast majority of our damage output is buffed by Deadly and Thumb, we will get the next best damage increase by further building into our overall DPS output by running a CP like Wrathful Strikes. Though running a slottable like Biting Aura would buff an individual ability like Jabs for example at a higher value than Wrathful would, choosing a CP that buffs 100% of our DPS output at a lower total value will be more of a DPS increase than running a CP that buffs a much smaller percentage of our total damage output at a slightly higher value. Regarding the other primary damage CP, Biting Aura will be your next best CP to use if you want to replace something like Exploiter. This skill buffs the next highest percentage of your overall damage output, buffing both jabs and our AoEs. Fighting is also worthwhile in AoE burst situations whenever running an AoE spammable, such as trash pulls for example. Master at Arms is the weakest of the alternative CP and will rarely, if ever, be run. The only situation you might want to consider using it would be for trash pulls. As some situational alternatives for your CP, in optimization situations that leave you a bit under the 18,200 penetration cap, you can opt to run Force of Nature in place of either Exploiter or Wrathful. This CP gives about 660 pen per status effect, which in an organized group should reliably give you an average of about 2,000 extra penetration over the course of an entire fight. Likewise, in situations where you might be under the 125% crit damage cap for whatever reason, you can make up for the lost crit damage by running either Backstabber or Fighting Finesse to ensure that you are still at crit cap. Backstabber should be run in fights where you can consistently flank the boss, that is, stand behind it, for the entire duration of a fight. And Fighting Finesse should be used when you cannot accomplish this. To summarize this section in a simple do this type of list, for race we choose High Elf, for Mundus we choose Thief, for our attributes, we stick all 64 points into Mag. For our food, we will run blue Bystat food most commonly. And for our potions, we'll run Heroism pots that we will switch to the Alliance Spell Power potions below 40% if you want to be sweaty, or just run the Alliance Spell Power potions if you don't want to worry about that. Finally, for our CP, we will use Exploiter, Thaumaturge, Deadly Aim, and Wrathful Strikes. With the commonalities that each of these builds will share out of the way, I'm going to give you 4 different builds for the Templar, all of which will maximize damage in different types of encounters. For each of these builds, I'll offer alternative setups that you can use for the sake of ease and or acquisition if you don't like the initial sets I suggest. Finally, all of these builds will have commonalities, so this section is designed to be watched through from the beginning to the end if you want the most information possible. For those of you interested in just the build, the info in each section alone is plenty to get you started, but keep in mind most of the detailed information related to skills will be in the first build discussed. So with that, getting into our single target setup for the Plar, this is the build that we use in situations where you want to optimize the amount of damage you're doing to one individual target. This is best represented with the 21mm dummy, so you could also call this the dummy setup. Remember, alternative gear options are provided at the end of the build. We will opt to run Highland Sentinel on the body, Perfected Arms of Reliquin on the weapons and jewelry, the Velathier Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Perfected Merciless Charge Arena Weapon, and one piece of the Slime Crown monster set. Diving into our set choices, starting with Highland Sentinel. This is a really unique craftable introduced in Gold Road that offers an ungodly amount of critical chance, which builds at 357 per stack, stacking up to 10 times. The only major downside is that anytime you move, you lose half your stacks. This guide emphasizes optimization, so it's important to know that this is one of the strongest sets in the game, but due to its difficulty to maintain, other options will be provided shortly. With enough practice though, Highland Sentinel is usable in probably 50% of trial content, most of which I would say is older content such as Kind's Aegis, Sunspire, or most of the fights in the Halls of Fabrication. The damage difference between Highland Sentinel and other alternatives is very small though, so on console for the Templar specifically, this is mostly a dummy set, and on PC, this is one to use when you can maximize your utilization with it. This set must be run on the body so that it's active on both bars. Our next set from the Trial Cloud Rest, Perfected Arms of Reliquin, is the strongest proc set in the game. It applies stacks of Harmful Winds, which deals damage per stack once every second, stacking up to 10 times. These stacks last for 4 seconds and are refreshed every time you light attack, dealing up to 8k damage per tick, resulting in about 8 to 10k DPS over the course of an entire fight. Simply maintaining a solid rotation with good weaving will maximize damage with this set and allow it to be front barred. This is important since Highland Sentinel needs to be bodied. Doing so means that we can't spend more than 3 seconds on the back bar though, that is 3 skill casts, or we risk the set falling off. Losing our 10 stacks pretty much kills the damage of the set since they take quite some time to build back up all the way. In short fights where we can't build and maintain 10 stacks for very long, or in fights where the boss has multiple or quick invuln phases that would cause our stacks to drop, we're better off using an alternative. And with that, the conversation for the best monster, mythic, and arena weapon combo is an extremely tight race for the Magplar. The Velathier Mage's Amulet is barely the strongest of this set grouping. This mythic gives us a little bit of penetration, a permanent source of minor force, and increases our damage done by an astounding 15%. This is all at the expense of our light attack damage though, since our damage with light attacks is decreased by 99%. On most classes, light attacks can make up a pretty significant portion of our overall DPS output. On the Templar though, one of our main abilities is a 2-second channeled spammable, which means that we will be light attacking a little less often, and that makes our light attack damage account for a smaller amount of our DPS output on this class compared to others. The massive increase in damage done to our beam, especially in combination with the much more optimal trade-off, makes this mythic a best in slot choice. The only exception to this is if you were in a double bow setup, since the bow passive makes its light attacks significantly stronger. And if this is the case, we'd replace Velothi with a monster set. Since one of our 5-piece sets requires it to be bodied, we will have to run some sort of an arena weapon on the back bar. We have many choices for the Plar, each of which will be best in slot in different situations, but for a pure single target fight with this particular skill setup, the Maelstrom Greatsword will provide the strongest damage increase, especially with the buffs it received in Update 44. Roughly 40 to 45% of our DPS output is direct damage, which doesn't even include Radiant Oppression. The 12% increase in damage from this weapon will result in about a 5% total increase in our DPS compared to the next best option, which we will discuss in depth shortly, the Master's Bow, which will provide about a 3% increase in damage. Finally, since we are running a Mythic plus Arena weapon combo, we will have one more gear slot available. The strongest one piece that we can run is the Slimecraw monster set from the Wayrest Sewers. Set bonuses in ESO are standardized, meaning that when you look at a set, if it offers a line of crit chance, it will be at a value of 657. Slimecraw, for some reason, is the only set in the game that offers 771 crit chance, which ends up being the strongest one-piece bonus in the game. Before looking at alternative sets, let's discuss the bar setup. Starting on our front bar with Barbed Trap, the ability itself provides about 4.5 to 5k DPS between the dot and damage on application, but also increases our chance to apply the hemorrhaging status effect, which accounts for another 2k DPS on this class. This means Trap provides a total of about 7k DPS, making it one of the stronger abilities in the game. This skill will also increase our damage done on this bar thanks to the Fighters Guild passive Slayer, which increases weapon and spell damage by 3% per Fighters Guild ability slotted. Trap's final use is the fact that it provides Minor Force, a buff essential to our damage output. This is only relevant when not using the Velothi or Mage's Amulet though, since this mythic provides the same buff at a more constant rate. Next up, Power of the Light is one of the strongest abilities in this setup and is a trademark classic for the Templar. This ability does a small amount of damage on application and explodes 6 seconds later, dealing a little more damage at base value but increasing its damage done by up to 200% based on the amount of damage that you did to its target over its duration. This results in a max tick of up to 95k, resulting in 11.5k DPS. When combined with the initial damage done on application, which has a max tick of about 31k and is worth another 3.5k DPS, Power of the Light ends up being about as strong as our spammable when maintained effectively, resulting in about 15k total DPS over the course of an entire fight. Moving on to our strongest spammable for the Magplar, Puncturing Sweeps deals 3 ticks of damage over a 0.8 second window, coming in with a max tick of about 22k each, so this skill will do up to 66k total damage for one full cast. Keep in mind that this value would be a lot higher if we didn't begin using Radiant Oppression at about 42% though in place of sweeps. This skill will do about half the amount of damage to other enemies around it in a cone, so it does produce some decent AoE damage as well, but requires a bit of mastery in ensuring that whatever target you want to prioritize becomes Jab's main target. Finally, this skill will also heal you for 34% of the damage inflicted, which isn't necessarily the reason that we run it, but does mean that we will not very often have to use a different source of self-healing in really any 4 or 12-man situation. Moving on to my personal favorite Templar ability, Radiant Oppression is by far the strongest skill in this toolkit and is even one of the best abilities in the game. Radiant Oppression does a decent amount of base damage over a 1.8 second window, that is about 66% of the damage of jabs, but this value is increased by up to 500% to enemies below 50% health. This makes Radiant Oppression the absolute strongest execute in the game, coming in with a max tick of nearly 170k, and that's just one of 3 ticks over its duration. So over that 1.8 second window of time, it will do up to 510k. We start using Radiant Oppression over our primary spammable at about 42%, and doing so will result in nearly 30k DPS from this ability alone. Absolutely mind-blowing damage. Our last main front bar ability, Degeneration, is a relatively weak dot in this setup that we use as our primary source of major sorcery, the weapon and spell damage buff, so that we can run ulti pots throughout a fight. This is mainly relevant for situations where you don't have a DK support of some sort, providing the group with igneous weapons, an ability that gives this extremely important buff to allies for over 2 minutes. When you can have this skill provided to your group, degen will become our main flex slot. Outside of this niche component, degen will do 3.5k DPS over the course of a fight, partially because we stopped casting this skill at around 30 to 40%, but it will do more DPS if you don't switch potions in the middle of a fight, and therefore cast degen more often. Finally, the skill will also increase the damage of our front bar abilities through the Magicka controller passive in the Mage's Guild tree, which increases max mag by 2% per Mage's Guild ability slotted. For our ultimate on the front bar, the Templar is one of the only classes in the game that makes intentional use out of our front bar ult, Flawless Dawnbreaker. This ulti does a little bit of damage when cast, but is mainly relevant because it increases our weapon and spell damage by 300 for 20 seconds. It ends up becoming more worthwhile to use this ultimate over Shooting Star once we start using Radiant Oppression, because the damage of Dawnbreaker plus the increase in damage our beam receives will result in more total DPS than casting Shooting Star again. It's a pretty neat little element to the class. Like with Trap, running Dawnbreaker on the front bar will increase our damage with the Slayer passive in the Fighter's Guild tree. Moving on to the back bar, starting with Ritual of Retribution. Ritual is one of the strongest sources of damage the Templar has access to, and one of the largest AoEs in the game. Ritual ticks once every 2 seconds, ramping in damage over its duration, resulting in a max tick of about 19k. This means that we absolutely have to let Ritual fully expire in order to fully benefit from the damage component of the skill. Another benefit of letting the skill fully expire is based around its cost. It's super expensive, and sustaining mag on the Plar can get really tricky, so overcasting this ability, meaning reapplying it earlier than necessary, is going to hurt your sustain down the road as well. As a final benefit, having this ability slotted for raid is even more essential since it offers the Purify synergy. This is one of 2 synergies in the game that is usable for all 12 players in a raid group simultaneously, making it one of the most reliable ways to proc Alkosh, an extremely important buff set usually run on the buff DK in group to help everyone reach the pen cap. Stampede is another really strong ability in this toolkit whose main importance is to proc the massive buff produced by the Maelstrom Greatsword. Stampede has a 15-second duration, but procs the effects of the VMA Greatsword for 18 seconds. So we can let this skill fall off for a little if necessary, but the damage this ability produces does mean that we want to try to keep it active as often as possible. Stampede's initial tick of damage will always crit at a max value of 31k, producing about 2k DPS over the course of a fight, and the AoE Stampede provides on impact ticks once per second at a max tick of 7.5k, resulting in about 5k DPS over the course of a fight. Altogether, the skill is responsible for about 7k DPS, making it one of the strongest dots in this setup. Next up, Carve is a bit of a misunderstood skill. The actual damage output of this ability is relatively weak, dealing about 1.2k DPS with its initial strike and 4 to 4.5k DPS for the actual dot, totaling in at about 5k DPS on average. The element of Carve that makes it so valuable is its duration. When at 3 stacks, the dot will last for 32 seconds, allowing us to use more total spammable casts over the course of an entire fight. So when comparing Carve to other alternatives with roughly the same DPS value, but shorter timers, Carve will typically win because of its duration. Vampire's Bane is in a similar boat to Carve, but it does even less damage, totaling in at only 3.5 to 4k DPS when combining the dot and damage dealt on its application. Keep in mind though that we stopped casting Vampire's Bane between 30 and 40%, so this value is a little underinflated. The value of Vampire's Bane is in both its duration and the fact that it provides major savagery and prophecy, the weapon and spell crit buffs. It's this ability in combination with degen that gives us the ability to run ulti pots, and if you want to run ult or tripots in content, you must use this skill. Continuing the trend of weak skills that mainly exist to buff our damage, Solar Barrage produces an AoE around you that will tick for up to 10.5k, resulting in about 4k DPS over the course of an entire fight, but will increase our damage done with class abilities by 5%. This includes our most important sources of damage in Jabs, Power of the Light, and Radiant Oppression. This is a significant damage increase, one that's important enough to even try to keep up until the very end of a fight to ensure that our beam is ticking as hard as possible. Finally, our ultimate of choice for the Templar, Shooting Star will be the strongest option. This ult will do an absolutely massive blast of damage on impact, ticking for up to 98k, and it will leave behind a small AoE that will tick once per second at a max value of 27k, resulting in about 5.5k DPS despite switching to Dawnbreaker at around 35 to 40% for a total of 7k DPS. This would be closer to 9 to 10k though if we were using it for the entire parse. This is also about as much damage as other alternatives like Everlasting Sweep will do, for example, but we end up choosing Shooting Star because it's better to weave and because it will restore some ult per target hit as well. Even in a pure single target situation, the 12 ult for hitting just one target is enough to make Shooting Star just barely the strongest option. But in single target fights where Shooting Star can clip a few stray adds, it will be even better. The final section for this build, moving into our alternative set choices. These options will produce stronger DPS in situations where maintaining sets like Highland or Reliquin may be too difficult. You can also use these sets with near identical success over the given choices if you simply prefer them. So one of the first 5-piece sets that we'll discuss, also from the Trial Cloud Rest, the next strongest set for single target is Perfected Mantle of Sororia if you don't like Highland Sentinel. Sororia is also a bit of a movement-based set, but was used with high success and mastery many years ago as a regular meta option in pretty much all content, and it's way easier to use and maintain these days. Light attacking places a circle on the ground, and standing in this circle grants stacks of Sororia's boon, which increases weapon and spell damage by 63 for 5 seconds, stacking up to 10 times for a max value of up to 630 weapon and spell damage. When we run Reli plus Sororia, Reliquin will usually be run on the body, so that we benefit from the crit damage passives medium armor provides, and Sororia will be run on the front bar. So we just have to, at worst, light attack on our front bar once every 3 to 4 seconds to guarantee that we maintain our stacks, only having to stand still for the first 10 seconds to build them. This should be very manageable in most content scenarios. Another 5-piece worth mentioning in place of Reliquin is Perfected Null Arca from the new Trial Lucent Citadel. This set grants stacks of Sliver whenever you deal critical damage, stacking every half second up to 3 times, and when you reach 3 stacks, a crystal fires to the targeted enemy. And if you're tracking and prioritizing this set, it can end up doing a little bit more damage than Reliquin with good crit. The problem is that this set is based on your critical chance to some degree, so if you get bad crits, Reliquin's going to be better, but if you get good crits, Null Arca is going to be better. So while Null Arca has a higher ceiling, you'll get more consistent results with Reliquin. And that said as well, Null Arca in content can be a little unreliable, since you can't always guarantee that it hits the target that you want it to if there's more than one enemy. For this reason, I prefer to use Reliquin when parsing, but you can get slightly better results with Null Arca. As a final note, it's a lot more complicated to use than Reliquin as well, since if you aren't really making it a priority to try to get this crystal to fire on cooldown, you also won't maximize damage with this set, and Reliquin will just straight up be stronger. When discussing alternative options for our monster, mythic, and arena weapon combo, the Selene monster set is an extremely close second for single target damage, outputting about 6.5k DPS, by far the most damage individually out of any monster set. Keep in mind though that this does proc off of martial melee damage, and our only reliable source of this is our light attacks with our daggers. The next best option is from the dungeon scale color peak, Zon. The Zon monster set procs whenever our light attacks crit, and will produce about 4.5k DPS over the course of an entire fight on its own, in addition to adding about 1 to maybe 1.5k DPS with the burning status effect as well. This is a good option to run if you aren't using Velothi and not running daggers to proc Selene, or if you just want to add a little extra AoE damage to this setup. Keep in mind though that while Zon can do AoE damage, I wouldn't consider it to be a super reliable source. Next up from the Dragonstar Arena, the Master's Bow is the next strongest arena weapon that we can run on the Magplar. This weapon increases our weapon and spell damage by 330 to targets afflicted with Poison Arrow, which ends up being about a 3% increase in total damage with this setup. Keep in mind though that in fights that are shorter where Radiant Oppression will be more valuable, the Master's Bow will begin to pull ahead of the VMA Greatsword. The VMA Greatsword is good in content, but the Plar's value in raids mainly come from our executability. So using a weapon that increases our damage done with Radiant Oppression in real scenarios will typically result in not only a little bit more damage, but a little bit safer progression, especially in optimized raiding groups. As a final alternative for single target damage from the Black Rose Prison, the BRP Bow is uniquely meta on the Plar in very specific fights. This weapon applies a massive damage over time effect whenever you use Scattershot, but only for 4 seconds. The duration of this dot can be extended though up to 12 seconds, depending on how far away from your target you are. We have a lot of melee abilities in this toolkit, so getting far away from a boss isn't usually ideal. Fights that have bosses with unique or massive hitboxes though will maximize the range of this weapon without having to get out of melee range. There are very few fights that this weapon works on, one example being Teleria, the final boss in Dreadsail Reef. However, when this little trick does work, it ends up being by far the strongest arena weapon in the game for single target, bar none. Getting into our universal content build for the Plar, this is the most common setup that you'll see used in content and one that will always be good and reliable damage in every fight. Though it probably won't ever fully min-max your damage in any individual fight, since there's almost always some small change that you can make to a setup per encounter to do just a tad more damage. This might be your one-size-fits-all for console rating though, for example. Remember, alternative gear options are provided at the end of the build. We will opt to run Deadly Strike on the body, Perfected Whirl of Depths on the weapons and jewelry, the Velathier Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Master's Bow, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. Starting with our first set from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil, Deadly Strike increases your damage done with damage over time and channeled abilities. This makes up the vast majority of the Templar's toolkit, buffing around 70% of our damage output, making Deadly a very versatile stick it on and leave it medium armor set. Essentially, whenever we can't maintain the proc sets that are slightly stronger, like Reli, Sororia, or Highland, Deadly will be the best option. Since it's our medium armor set, we'll make sure that we run it on the body. And on our weapons and jewelry, we'll run Whirl of Depths. From the trial Dreadsail Reef, Perfected Whirl of Depths is a light armor set that does a solid amount of AoE damage and is pretty easy to maintain. Whenever you deal damage with a light attack, an 8-second dot will be applied to your target, and upon its expiration will leave behind a massive AoE that does a ton of damage to your target and any other surrounding enemy. This will result in about 8k DPS on average to just one target, a number that will obviously increase the more targets that are hit. This makes the set only slightly weaker than Reliquin from the lens of a single target fight, which makes it generically a strong option for any encounter. Since part of the set's damage is based around a short AoE, you may want to occasionally be careful of when you proc it in fights that have movement, such as Reef Guardian hard mode for example. If you're moving to the next plant location, proccing depths just before you move is going to leave an AoE on the ground that all the reefs will walk out of. A pretty rare caveat, but one to be aware of. We will pair these sets with the Velathier Mage's Amulet, the strongest mythic that we can run on the Plar, one piece of the Slimecraw monster set since it offers the best one-piece stat in the game, and the Master's Bow. The Master's Bow in this setup will give us more AoE damage than a greatsword, and our bar setup is a little different, so we don't have quite as many sources of direct damage, which will just make the Master's Bow a little stronger anyway for this particular setup. And on that note, for our skills in this setup, starting on our front bar, we will run Barbed Trap, mainly for the damage the dot itself does, the extra hemorrhaging it provides, and for the 3% weapon and spell damage provided through the Slayer passive. Power of the Light is still a must-have since it outputs about 15k total DPS and is just one of the strongest skills that we can run. Jabs is still our primary spammable, and its main value is as a single target spammable, but it's cheap, does pretty good AoE damage, and heals us for a ton, so it's a no-brainer. The first real change that will come to this bar setup, instead of running Radiant Oppression, we'll run the other morph, Radiant Glory. This morph does almost just as much damage as Radiant Oppression, increasing in damage by up to 480% instead of 500%, but will also heal us for a large portion of the damage inflicted, and it will restore some Magicka, which will make Templar sustain significantly easier. In real content situations, the damage trade-off is very minimal, and the extra mag sustain and healing that we get makes the Templar borderline indestructible. The first actual skill swap that we'll make, we will replace Degeneration in content most often with Quick Cloak. This assumes though that your group has a standard raid comp that includes a Dragon Knight somewhere running Igneous Weapons. Igneous Weapons gives the entire group the major weapon and spell damage buffs, so we wouldn't need to source them from degen. Quick Cloak will provide about 4 to 5k DPS on its own over the course of a fight, and much like a few other abilities, mostly acts as a long dot that will do decent damage, while allowing you to use more overall spammable casts throughout a fight. Cloak is also a weapon skill, which means that it will proc your dagger enchant, something that's super useful on a class like the Plar, where we light attack a little less often while using channeled abilities. Finally, Quick Cloak gives a brief speed boost for 4 seconds when cast, and offers major evasion, an absolutely massive mitigation buff. Our ult on the front bar will still be Flawless Dawnbreaker, mainly for the passive mentioned earlier, but we will still use this ult when focusing main targets that are under 40% when we are casting Radiant Glory. Moving on to our back bar, Ritual is an extremely strong and large AoE that does good damage and provides your group with one of the most important synergies in the game, Purify, mainly for your Zenkosh, since it's one of 2 synergies in the game that can be viewed by more than 6 people at a time. We will obviously not be able to run Stampede or Carve in this setup though, so instead we will replace those with Endless Hail and Poison Injection. The only value with Endless Hail is simply its damage. It's an extremely strong ability that will output 6 to 7k DPS in a pretty large AoE radius, so whenever we are running a bow, slotting Endless Hail is just a no-brainer. This setup makes use of the Master's Bow, which makes Poison Injection an absolute must-have. This ability is mainly used to proc the effects of the Master's Bow, but it will do about 4 to 5k DPS when you combine the damage on application and damage over time effects of the skill. This morph ramps up in damage, dealing up to 120% more damage to targets under 50% health, making it even more valuable on a class as execute heavy as the Plar is. The rest of our abilities will follow our single target setup. Vampire's Bane we use mainly as another decent but long damage over time effect, which will also act as our source of major prophecy and savagery. Solar Barrage is essential. It does a little bit of damage, but the main value is the 5% buff that it gives to our class abilities, most notably increasing the damage of Power the Light, Jabs, and Radiant Oppression. Finally, Shooting Star is the ultimate that will use above 40% for the Templar, and it's simply one of the strongest ults in the game, especially when considering the AoE and burst it can produce as well. For our alternate set options for this build, we have a few really unique sets to consider depending on the content you're trying to get into. The only proc set worth mentioning that can be used with great success for the Templar is Aegis Collar. This set comes from the dungeon Unhallowed Grave and, like Depths, has very simple proc conditions. Aegis Collar requires a martial melee attack to crit, so essentially whenever our dagger light attacks crit, we will summon a lesser Aegis that will do a ton of damage in a large AoE radius around the target. If you need a little extra cleave in fights where our Azure setup won't be worthwhile, you'll want to pair Aegis and Depths together. For the sake of pure simplicity though, Perfected Onsl's Torment is a medium armor set from the trial Sanity's Edge, and is really an option to consider if you don't want to worry about tracking, procking, and maintaining the previously mentioned options, since min-maxing damage with just about every set that we've discussed up to this point does require, at bare minimum, some effort. Onsel simply offers a 7% damage done bonus, which doubles to 14% if you interrupt a target. But this scenario is so rare that it's not even worth factoring in. The 7% damage done bonus makes Onsel a set choice that is only a couple percent behind the previously mentioned options. So if you're looking for strong and simple damage, this is the set for you. As a final 5-piece set to talk about, Kvatch Gladiator is a craftable from the Gold Coast zone that offers nearly 1500 weapon and spell damage against targets who are below 25% health. For context, this is more than double the amount of weapon and spell damage that Sororia gives. The problem is that for the first 75% of the fight, this is a completely wasted set. This makes Kvatch a great set for progression, when you might want to make it a priority to absolutely nuke the end of a fight for safety. The most obvious example that comes to mind is the final boss in Sanity's Edge, Onsel Hard Mode. The last 20% of the fight is arguably the most difficult encounter in the game, and a group attempting to secure a hard mode clear or even a trifecta could opt to put 1 or 2 Plars in this set to nuke this phase as quickly as possible. Kvatch will never be the strongest overall DPS, but it's great for situations like these. Finally, as a situational mythic to be aware of for real content scenarios, in some sweatier situations, your group might opt to use Crypt Cannon Vestments. This set will grant minor heroism and will no longer allow you to use your ultimate ability, instead transferring the ult that you consume to your allies, dispersing the ult given equally between players. In 12-man content, you'll usually slot this on the damage dealer with the weakest ult, which will almost always end up being the Plar. When compared with Languid Eye, Standard, Incap, Atro, or even the weird Shooting Star plus Bone Goliath combo the Necro is using this patch, the Templar's Shooting Star is simply the weakest, so much so that we use an ult that buffs our beam over an actual damage ult in Xe. For this reason, Crypt Cannon will most likely go to the Plar when your group comp calls for it. Getting into our AoE boss build, this is a setup used to maximize the AoE damage that you do in longer boss encounters where there are multiple high priority targets. The main fight examples that come to mind are fights like Boss A Hard Mode, the second boss in Rockgrove, or Reef Guardian Hard Mode, the second boss in Dreadsail Reef, just to name a couple. Remember, alternative gear options are provided at the end of the build. We will opt to run Azurblight Reaper on the body, Perfected Boss A's Mania on the weapons and jewelry, the Velothi Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Perfected Crushing Wall Arena weapon, and and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. Diving into this build by discussing the absolute strongest AoE set in the game, bar none, the Update 44 PTS cycle was an absolute roller coaster for Azure Blight Reaper, but at the end of it all, this set came out stronger than ever. From the dungeon layer of Marsalok, Azure Blight Reaper applies stacks of Blight Seed to a target when it is hit with a damage over time effect. At 20 stacks, the seed explodes, dealing damage based on the amount of targets hit, maxing out at a 600% increase in damage. Compared to Update 43, Azure saw a huge nerf to this damage when just one target is present, and a small nerf when 2 or more targets are present. However, above 2 targets, this set's damage was buffed like crazy, and likely somewhat intentionally, as it is now even stronger in all of the situations we were previously using it in, such as Reef or Bosse. Only one Blight Seed can be active on one target at a time. However, anyone running the set can contribute to building its stacks. This means that if 7 damage dealers are running Azure, it's going to build and proc near instantly, and in fact, there seems to be a bug currently in Update 44 that makes Azure worth running on as many DDs as possible, since the cooldown seems to be based on the individual as opposed to the set. This is currently allowing Azure to proc more often than intended, so enjoy it while it lasts. We will run Azure on the body and pair it with Bosse on the weapons and jewelry. And with that from the Trial Rock Grove, Perfected Bosse's Mania is a light armor set that increases your damage based on the amount of max mag that you're missing, up to 12%. Keeping your mag at around 20 to 30% on average will result in a DPS increase of about 9%, which makes Bosse one of the best options that we can use to increase our raw damage. We need to pair Azure with a trial set, and our options for that are relatively limited on the Templar for the sake of consistent and strong AoE damage. So using a set like this will simply increase our damage done and place the emphasis in our AoE toolkit. We will continue to pair these sets with the strongest mythic for AoE damage in the game, the Velothir Mage's Amulet, as well as one piece of the Slimecraw monster set since it offers the strongest one-piece bonus for damage dealing in the game. In addition to this, we will opt to run the Perfected Maelstrom Inferno. The VMA Inferno is one of the best AoE sets in the game. It increases your damage done with Wall of Elements to such a degree that it will begin doing more DPS than a full 5-piece trial set like Reliquin, and that's just in a pure single target situation. That value obviously amplifies dramatically the more targets that are hit. Wall is one of the largest AoEs in the game, so getting a damage increase this strong to a skill that can hit essentially an unlimited amount of targets when it's placed well is a no-brainer. For our skills in this setup, starting on the front bar, we will run Barb Trap mainly for the damage the dot itself does, the extra hemorrhaging it provides, and for the 3% weapon and spell damage provided through the Slayer passive. Our next skill, Camo Hunter, will replace Power of the Light, since Power of the Light can only hit one target at a time. Keep in mind that you should still run Power of the Light if you're the only Templar in group and there is no DK. This is due to a passive that we'll discuss a little bit later on. Camo Hunter is slotted on our bar in an AoE situation mainly because of its passive buffs. This ability will give us Major Prophecy and Savagery on the front bar, a buff that is necessary to source from a skill like this when we choose to drop Vamp Bane if we want to run Ulti or Tripods. It will also increase our weapon and spell damage by 3% thanks to the Fighters Guild passive Slayer, and it will give us Minor Berserk whenever flanking our target, a buff that increases our damage by 5%. Minor Berserk is typically provided by the Healer's Combat Prayer, or even more commonly in Update 44, Banner Bearer. So if you have good sources of this buff, you could opt to run Inner Light instead, a skill that we'll discuss in more depth in the next section. In an AoE situation, we will want to replace our primary spammable jabs with Blazing Spear. Blazing Spear does only slightly less damage on impact, but it doesn't have any sort of reduced damage for hitting multiple targets like jabs, so it ends up pulling ahead in AoE encounters. Blazing Spear will also leave behind a 10-second dot, which will not only help build more Blight Seed stacks, but will also further narrow the DPS gap between Spear and jabs, since this skill will be ticking whenever we are reapplying other dots as well. In this build, we will slot Radiant Glory since it will still end up being by far the best DPS when using it against low health targets, and having a way to burst down low health adds or the boss in Xe is just a good idea in general. We will run Quick Cloak here as well since we can get some good AoE value out of the skill with good positioning, and Flawless Dawnbreaker to buff our front bar abilities, or even to use to increase the damage of our beam when the main boss is below 40%. On the back bar, we will continue running Ritual since it's an extremely strong and big AoE that does good damage and provides your group with one of the most important synergies in the game. Purify, mainly for your Zenkosh, since it's one of 2 synergies in the game that can be viewed by more than 6 people at a time. And next up, since we are running a staff, we obviously lose access to skills like Stampede, Carve, Endless Hail, and Poison Injection, so we will opt to run Elemental Blockade and Anti-Cavalry Caltrops in their place. In any situation, pairing Wall with the Maelstrom Inferno is an absolute no-brainer. Wall is one of the largest and strongest AoEs in the game, and its damage in a pure single-target situation can outperform a lot of meta 5-piece sets. This value is obviously amplified in an AoE situation where if Wall is doing 8k DPS to the boss, and 8k DPS to an ad, it's actually doing 16k DPS. The more targets, the more value. Anti-Cavalry Caltrops is another very large and strong AoE worth about 5k single target DPS, a value that amplifies much like Wall in an AoE scenario. I really like Caltrops as well because we have so many mag-based abilities in this setup that sustaining mag can get really tricky, so having a strong and short stamina-based ability will relieve a little bit of pressure. And on the note of mag gen, we will replace Vamp Bane with Channeled Focus, since we are using the ever-expensive Wall and Blazing Spear. Having a way to restore some Magicka is super helpful. Channeled Focus gives unnamed Magicka regen, which means that it can stack with the major and minor intellect buffs. This skill restores 242 Magicka every 1 second over its 25-second duration. Activating the skill gives this regen buff no matter what, but it also will leave a rune on the ground. This rune, while standing in it, will offer Major Resolve, a buff usually provided by the Warden Healer, and it will offer a little bit more healing as well. Again, the rune isn't necessary for the recovery, but it does offer some nice bonuses if you can stand in it. As with every other build, Solar Barrage is still a must-have since it will buff our primary spammable in Blazing Spear as well as Radiant Oppression. However, for our ultimate, since we are running a Destruction Staff on the back bar, we get to use the strongest ultimate in the game, Elemental Rage, in place of Shooting Star. There really isn't a ton to say about Elemental Rage, it's pretty straightforwardly the strongest ult that you can use. In terms of alternate sets for this build, I don't have anything new to introduce, but if you don't like the Magicka minigame associated with Boss A, you can run Depths in its place for relatively stationary fights, or Perfected Onsl's Torment for the sake of ease, or even where Depths might not be very good anyway. Both of these sets will result in only 1 to 2% less DPS when compared to a well-maintained Boss A setup. So run whatever you're comfortable with here ultimately, knowing that Depths should do slightly more damage than Onsel. Getting into our Trash build, this is a setup used to maximize the AoE burst damage you do in Trash pulls. This is a setup that you can save to switch in and out of on PC, but something that I feel console players should mostly be aware of as opposed to using. Remember, alternative gear options are provided at the end of the build. We will opt to run Azurblight Reaper on the body, Perfected Solzon's Torment on the weapons and jewelry, the Velathier Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Perfected Crushing Wall Arena weapon, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. If you looked at the last build, many of these sets are actually recycled. Azur is just the uncontested meta for any AoE situation right now, so this has to be in your Trash setup. The VMA Inferno is another incredibly strong AoE set, especially for short bursty situations like Trash pulls, and the Slimecraw monster provides the strongest one-piece bonus out of any other set in the game. So the new set to talk about here is Perfected Solzon's Torment. From the trial Rockgrove, Solzon is a medium armor set that offers some of the absolute best stats for Trash. Whenever a target is killed, including one of those small 200k health adds, a vengeful soul is left behind in the form of a blue beam. Running over this beam gives you the Solzon buff, which increases your crit chance by 2160 and your crit damage by 12%, both for 30 seconds. Good crits make up the majority of good Trash damage, and in these situations, applying all sources of crit damage in such a short window of time usually isn't possible, so Solzon will get us to our 125% crit cap instantly, and it will help our spammables to crit more often in these short bursty encounters. For our skills in this setup, if you are on console, you'll have to make good decisions about what skills are worth swapping, depending on if a boss has any sort of spawn time. The best example might be a fight like Rakat, the final boss in the Maw of Lorcaj. When you walk into the room, the boss animation takes about 20 seconds to complete before Rakat is even damageable, giving you plenty of time to swap as many skills as your heart desires. This is opposed to a fight like Yondir, the first boss in VKA, where you walk into the room and the boss is immediately damageable. Swapping out 1 or 2 skills in situations like Yondir will almost always be worthwhile, especially if you're fast. But more than that can end up losing you more total trial time than the time you actually saved by using the Trash skills on ads. Play around with this concept and see what works best for you and your group. If you're not score pushing, taking the extra time to swap out as many skills as necessary to make each individual fight quicker, despite a slower overall trial time, is probably the safest option for all content. For our skills, starting on the front bar, we will opt to replace Barb Trap with the strongest AoE spammable in the game, Whirling Blades. This is a stamina-based spammable that you can use when running daggers that does a solid amount of base damage that is amplified by 100% against enemies below 50% health, and will do an additional 20% increased damage on top of that to enemies under 25% health, thanks to the dual-wield passive Slaughter. For our actual trash rotation, we'll be able to use Blazing Spear until the elite adds are at about 50% health, where we can then start using Rolling Blades until the pull is finished. This will not only provide a ton of AoE burst, but will also help the Plar's atrocious sustain by effectively utilizing both our mag and stam pools. Continuing on the front bar, we will run Camo Hunter to buff our front bar abilities, where the majority of our damage will come from. Blazing Spear will be the strongest spammable that we can use while our targets are above 50% health, and Radiant Glory exists to clean up any elite adds that might not die at the same time as the rest of the overall pull. The next new skill to discuss is the other morph of Quick Cloak, Deadly Cloak. This morph does about 2k more damage per second than Quick Cloak at the cost of being a 20-second ability instead of a 30-second one. In trash situations, this is a worthy trade-off because pulls should be way shorter than 20 or 30 seconds anyway, so we might as well use the stronger morph since it won't affect the amount of spammable casts we'll use. If you are running Quick Cloak for a boss situation, you can still run that here, but if you aren't running Quick Cloak for bosses, morph it to Deadly Cloak for trash. For our ult on the front bar, we will stick with Flawless Dawnbreaker. We won't ever need to actually use this ult in trash, but the damage buffs that it will provide to our most important abilities on the front bar makes it still worth slotting. Moving on to the back bar, we will replace Ritual with Proxy Det, assuming the Kosh player won't need the Purify synergy. We'll talk a lot more about maximizing trash damage later on in the video, but one of the major concepts of dealing good trash damage is based around pre-buffing. Once a trash pull begins, we essentially want to get to and only use our spammable as quickly as possible, so slotting strong skills that we can use before a pull starts becomes more worthwhile. Q, Proximity Detonation. The skill does its damage in the form of a massive explosion around the player, and that damage is amplified based on the number of targets hit. For this reason, we want to try to time out Proxy Det so that it goes off right as the pull begins, so that it can hit the main targets in addition to all of the super low health adds before they die for maximum damage. The rest of the back bar will mimic the AoE Boss Setup. We will run Wall as a strong AoE paired with the Maelstrom Inferno, Caltrops as a big stamina-based AoE to both do good AoE damage and relieve some pressure on our mag sustain, Channeled Focus to pre-buff with between pulls to also assist our mag regen in this mag-heavy setup, Solar Barrage as another AoE that we can pre-buff with that will increase the damage of important class abilities, and finally Elemental Rage as the strongest AoE burst ult in the game. As a final note for console players regarding skills, you obviously won't have time to completely change your bars to mimic this setup, but stopping to swap a few skills between trash and boss fights will end up being worthwhile for overall trial time. Depending on how heavily you spec for AoE damage depends on what you'll change. Regardless of weapon, having an AoE spammable in either Whirling Blades or Blazing Spear will be your most important swap. Then your Destro ult if you're running a staff, and then the priority order goes Proxy Det, Caltrops, Camo Hunter, Deadly Cloak, Channeled Focus. Finally, discussing the alternative sets that you can use in trash pulls. I almost considered making one final build out of these next two sets because of how good they are. Starting with Mechanical Acuity, this is a craftable from the Clockwork City zone and is a super important set to be aware of, especially for PC players. Whenever you deal non-critical damage, you get a stack of Mechanical Acuity for 4 seconds, increasing your crit chance by 20%, stacking up to 5 times. This will bring your crit chance all the way to 100% for a very short period of time, and its cooldown is dramatic, not being able to proc again for 25 seconds. This makes Acuity the strongest option in the game for really short encounters. In Trash, this means that we should use Acuity for really dangerous pulls, such as the Trash Pack before Boss A in Rockgrove, the Trash Pack before Teleria in Dreadsail Reef, or the Trash Pull before Fallgraven in VKA, for example. Likewise, Mech Acuity will even be really strong in really short boss fights, such as the Snake mini-boss in VRG or the Spider in the Halls of Fabrication. Recently on the Templar, I've been using Mech Acuity a ton to obliterate 4-man content, the most notable fight so far of which was our Hunt Phase skip on Baylorg, the final boss in the March of Sacrifices, where we burned about 6 mil HP in just a 10-second window. Optimizing Mechanical Acuity can be a little tricky though. For raw damage output, you'll usually pair this set with an arena weapon of your choice on the back bar, the Velathier Mage's Amulet Mythic, the Baylorg Monster set, which we will discuss shortly, and 4-piece Lokestes in order to stack spell and weapon damage bonuses, since our crit will be perfect in this burst window anyway. You will only run Acuity assuming the fight is up to 20 seconds or less, and even 20 seconds is pushing it. If the fight is on the longer side of things, you'll want to stay in the Thief Mundus with Divine's body pieces to ensure that you don't tank below 30% crit chance when Acuity falls off. However, if the fight is about 10 seconds or less, you won't benefit from the Thief Mundus, making infused body pieces the next best choice. And you can even opt for the Shadow Mundus, something I do a ton when running Acuity in 4-man to hit the crit damage cap on this class. Finally, you'll only run Balorgh if the fight is 12 seconds or less, so that you can run Acuity with a Trial 5 piece of your choice in addition to the Arena Weapon and Velothi Mythic over 4-piece Loke in these situations. And on that note, Balorgh is the strongest monster set in the game for short, bursty fights. From the dungeon March of Sacrifices, Balorgh activates whenever you cast an ultimate, giving you weapon and spell damage equal to the amount of ult you consume, and penetration equal to 23 times the amount of ult you consume. That means that if you use an ultimate at 500, you will get 500 weapon and spell damage and 11,500 penetration for 12 seconds. In fights that are 12 seconds or less, using Balorgh is a no-brainer, but in fights that really are any longer, especially on the Plar where the majority of our damage comes from the execute phase, we'll be better off running something a little more traditional. Moving into the flex skills section of the video, though we've discussed the main bar setups that are run most commonly on the Plar in content, there are still so many skills that can be run to maximize your damage in individual encounters, or even help you build a bar setup that fits your playstyle. I've labeled the rest of these relevant skills into 3 categories: skills for raw damage dealing, skills for healing or survivability, and skills to assist with sustain. Starting with our skills for raw damage dealing, taking a look into the Adric Spear tree with Everlasting Sweep. This is the primary Templar ult that actually does a very comparable amount of damage to Shooting Star over the course of a fight. The ultimate only costs 75 ult, so the damage per cast is obviously weaker than Shooting Star, but when we factor in the fact that we can get 2 sweeps to 1 Shooting Star, the damage values are actually very close, only slightly favoring Shooting Star in a single target situation. The only major downside to Everlasting Sweeps is that we can't bar swap cancel the ability without losing weave speed. So in pure single target, Shooting Star becomes our go-to. It does have its place though. Everlasting Sweeps like Shooting Star will do a strong tick of damage on impact and leave behind a damage over time effect on any target hit in the form of a sticky dot. The duration of this dot increases per target hit. So in mobile AoE situations where ads might be walking around or out of Shooting Star's AoE, we could find a lot of value in Everlasting Sweep if there are enough ads to increase its duration considerably. The main example that comes to mind is Reef Guardian Hard Mode, where there are a ton of ads that will rotate at specific points in the fight to a brand new location. The other morph Crescent Sweep is a bit burstier, though worth a little less damage per cast. The main value of Crescent Sweep is that its damage will increase based on the amount of targets hit. Crescent Sweep will be a little better for overall damage over the course of an entire trial when compared to an ult like Elemental Rage, again mainly because of the cost. While the Destro ult is far stronger, being able to use Crescent Sweep in every single trash pull, as opposed to only being able to use the Destro ult in 1 or 2 of them, could be worthwhile for advanced groups. And that's assuming that there's not one particular pull that the group should be saving a big bursty ultimate for. Moving into the bow tree, Magnum Shot is a must-have whenever running the BRP bow in order to proc its insane effects. The skill itself does a decent bit of damage and will knock back non-elite ads, which is a lot of fun. Though this ability kind of does its damage like a spammable, when we run the BRP bow, we will use it like a dot, reapplying it only to refresh the effects of the weapon. Remember, you only run the BRP bow in fights that have bosses with goofy hitboxes, like Teleria in DSR for example. The other morph of Poison Injection, when running the Master's Bow, it's usually wise to run Venom Arrow instead because it gives major sorcery and brutality, the spell and weapon damage buff. Doing so allows us to replace degen with a more powerful skill like Cloak or even Blazing Spear if we can sustain it. In content, when a DK support is providing igneous weapons, this concept is irrelevant, so only use it if the buff is not being provided. Working our way into the Destruction Staff tree, 12-man content presents many mechanics that require you to go kill something without the debuff help of your support. In these situations, Elemental Susceptibility is a must-have to provide a long and consistent source of the most important debuff in the game, Major Breach, to try to help take out some of the armor resistances a portal-type target might have. Situations where LE-Sus is necessary would be something like VSS hard mode portals or even VCR hard mode portals. Both of these encounters give options as to who runs LE-Sus, so just make sure somebody has it, even if it has to be you. You can only run this skill though when running a staff on the back bar. In the Mage's Guild tree, Scalding Rune is a decent and strong sticky dot to be aware of that does a little more damage than degen. When you don't need the major buffs degen provides, and you might not get value out of a skill like Cloak or Camo Hunter, you can use this ability instead. I slotted Scalding on the front bar for the max mag bonus when soloing portals in VCR 3, and doing so made the Templar feel like one of the easiest classes in the game to handle that mechanic, to be honest. In the Sigil tree, Race Against Time can be a unique time saver, especially in some solo and 4-man scenarios. The skill provides minor force for 20 seconds when cast, able to be cast as a pre-buff, which isn't really relevant if you're running Velothi, as well as Major Expedition for 4 seconds, but most importantly, it removes and grants immunity to snares. In solo runs, moving through arenas quickly does play a factor in your overall score, and being able to purge snares and move fast is usually more of a time saver than an extra damage ability. In the Undaunted tree, Mystic Orb is a great skill to be aware of for the sake of group damage, and needs to be run by somebody in a raid comp. This ability is very strong, ticking for a ton once per second to any target it hits. The main reason that it's not really considered meta is because of its cost and duration. It's an extremely expensive 10-second ability, and its damage isn't high enough to be worth casting once every 10 seconds. That said though, it does offer one of the strongest synergies in the game, Combustion, which will do a ton of damage and restore resources to any ally that uses it. It's one of 2 synergies in the game that is visible to all 12 players at one time as well, making it an integral synergy to have for the sake of your Alkosh DD, since they'll mainly use Combustion and Purified to keep good uptimes with the important buff set. In the Assault tree, the other morph of Anti-Cavalry Caltrops, Razor Caltrops will do about as much damage per second, but will be a small overall DPS loss since it only lasts for 10 seconds. This means that we have to lose some casts of our spammable, reapplying Razor Caltrops a bit more frequently. But the trade-off is that we do get an AoE source of Major Breach. This is really important to have in general for solo or even 4-man content, but is also applicable to portal-style encounters in 12-man content when you aren't running a destruction staff and therefore can't run Elisus. To end this category, we finally get to include a scribed skill into one of these guides. Introduced in Update 44, Banner Bearer is an absolute must-have skill to slot on multiple damage dealers in group. There are a lot of ways that we can build into this ability, and the best way to do it probably hasn't been fully discovered. But what we do know so far is that you'll typically want to run these banners on parse TDs that have good class scripts. You can't stack the different focus scripts of the scribed ability though, so you'll want to choose the one that's going to increase the largest overall percentage of your group's DPS output. And your affix script should probably be Minor Berserk, since Banner Bearer presents the first true and 100% consistent source of this buff that we've ever seen in the game. Moving into our skills for survivability, when it comes to self-healing, the Templar has a few options. The best burst heal for situations when you are alone is Honor the Dead, from the Restoring Light tree. This heal is massive and will take you from near dead straight back up to full health with no issue. This morph can only hit one target though, which can make it a bit unreliable in situations where you are not alone. The benefit to this morph is that it refunds part of the cost over 6 seconds, so it's much easier to sustain than the other morph. A burst heal like this is best used when you don't need to heal often, but might simply need a one-off source of healing occasionally. And the best example of this is something like VCR portals in my opinion. The other morph, Breath of Life, though, is a bit more reliable in situations where you might not be alone, since this ability will heal 2 targets, though the second target is only healed for a third of the amount. Again, only use burst heals in situations where you are not taking constant damage, but where you are just taking damage here and there. An example of when to use this ability could be VSS hard mode portals. In the Mage's Guild tree, the other morph of Degen, Structured Entropy does just as much damage per second, but instead of offering the major weapon and spell damage buffs, gives a decent little heal over time. In situations where you are constantly taking a small amount of damage away from healers, Structured Entropy ends up being a nice middle ground for both damage and survivability. In the aforementioned example with the VSS hard mode portals, if you are experienced enough in the fight, you really shouldn't get hit by any of the big sources of damage. But there are small sources of damage that are unavoidable to some degree. Structured is more than enough to heal through these small sources of constant damage while still getting to use a decent dot, preventing a large DPS loss through slotting a dead skill like Breath of Life. In the Assault tree, Resolving Vigor is one of the strongest heals that any class has access to, period. Not only does it provide a massive heal over time, it also gives minor resolve, increasing physical and spell resistances by about 3,000. This doesn't sound like a huge deal, but it does provide a noticeable increase in survivability. In any situation where you might have to perform mechs away from healing, this is a great option for safety. The other morph, Echoing Vigor, I have seen used quite often in sweaty 4 and 12-man situations, where you might opt to drop a healer altogether in 4-man or only run one healer in 12-man. For example, if you drop a healer in 4-man, it's usually wise to have all 3 DDs slot Echoing Vigor, and if the group is experienced enough, this amount of healing will suffice for most content. Likewise, in 12-man content, a fight like the Orphic Shattered Shard, the second boss in Lucent Citadel, requires all of the DDs to split around the room and synergize the mirrors, which gives a pretty nasty dot. Echoing Vigor can be stacked, and having all 8 damage dealers cast this before moving out results in this ability stacking 3 to 5 times on every DD, providing a ton of extra healing while spread so far apart. Finally, touching on the skills that can help solve sustained issues, moving back into the Restoring Light tree. Radiant Aura is a skill that we can use to pre-buff with in solo situations for a bit of extra sustain help, as this ability provides minor intellect and endurance, increasing mag and stam recovery by 15% for 60 seconds. We have lots of sources of minor intellect and endurance in 12-man content, so this should only be something to note really again as a pre-buff for solo scenarios. We don't want to actively use this ability in place of a full damage skill, especially since there are better options for sustain if we need them. The other morph, Repentance, though, in trash pulls, will give the same buffs for simply being slotted on either bar, and activating the ability will consume corpses around you to restore stam and health. You might find it worthwhile to slot this skill on your bar in trash pulls when you are running Whirling Blades if you're having trouble sustaining the stamina required. Finally, the other morph of Channeled Focus, Restoring Focus, does all the same things, but it offers an unnamed source of stam regen instead of mag regen. Again, if you're struggling with stam, you can run this ability, but this is a skill I included mostly so that you're aware of its existence for extremely niche situations. And now for perhaps the most important section of this entire video. We now know how to build the Templar and even how to optimize it for certain fights and encounters. But none of that matters if we don't know how to play the class. We'll start by discussing the core building blocks of the Templar. That is, how the class functions and how to play the class in a damage maximizing way. After we discuss the fundamentals, we will take a look at a static and dynamic rotation to see these principles in action. Once we understand the fundamentals and what the rotation looks like in a cookie cutter single target situation, we will finish off by discussing how to adapt these rotations to real content scenarios to better understand how to maximize your damage in any encounter in the game. So let's start by discussing the elements of the Templar that make the class unique, beginning with our most important passives. When optimizing raid comps, groups will build to get all of their players to 18,200 penetration and 125% crit damage. The Plar has no passive source of pen, but it does have a passive source of crit damage through the Piercing Spears passive. This increases our crit damage by 10% straight up with no condition. Crit damage is the modifier that decides how much additional damage our critical strikes will do, and this value maxes at 125%, meaning that we cannot receive any further benefits for going over 125. So when creating builds, we don't have to consider weaker options like the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt or weaker CP like Fighting Finesse or Backstabber to reach that cap in 12-man. In addition to this, the Piercing Spear passive makes the Templar a naturally strong class for solo and 4-man content as well, since we will have a much easier time getting to 125 than most other classes when we don't have the help of a full raid group. While most of the passives you can get in the game will be helpful to some degree, I feel that they're all pretty self-explanatory. Balanced Warrior, for example, gives 6% weapon and spell damage, but you can read the passive and know that it's probably good to have. So the rest of our discussion around the passives for the Plar are going to pertain to the few that actually require some semblance of gameplay to maximize the value of. Starting with Illuminate, this is the Templar's unique buff. This passive gives the only source of minor sorcery in the game to you and your allies whenever you cast a Dawn's Wrath ability for 20 seconds. Since this only gives spell damage for some reason, you need either a DK or Templar in group to make sure that you're getting either the minor weapon or minor spell damage buffs from these classes. On the DPS spec, we keep this passive active by simply maintaining our Dawn's Wrath abilities, one of which is Power the Light. So unless our rotation is really bad, we should have perfect uptimes. Next up, perhaps one of the most important passives to be aware of is Burning Light. This is one of the strongest sources of damage for the Plar on a CMX that we haven't even had a chance to discuss yet. This passive gives us a stack of Burning Light whenever we deal damage, stacking at once every half second. At 4 stacks, Burning Light explodes, dealing a ton of damage. and this results in about 7 to 8k DPS over the course of a fight. For context, our 5-piece trial set Reliquin only does about 9 to 10k DPS. That is an insane amount of damage to come from a passive. With all of our dots constantly ticking, we shouldn't have to worry about tracking and maintaining burning light too much. But the final element worth noting is that skills that tick multiple times per second, like jabs and radiant oppression, will help to proc this passive a little more often and add a little extra damage than what they might show at face value. The final passive worth discussing is Prism. This grants 3 ultimate whenever we cast a Dawn's Wrath ability, occurring once every 6 seconds. So again, if we are keeping up Power of the Light on cooldown, we are keeping this passive active at a 100% uptime, which not only contributes to the Templar's incredibly strong ult gen, but also ensures that our shooting star always lines up with the off-balance procs that we get on the dummy. And if off balance is kept up 100% of the time, that will also translate to content. Getting our ultimate to line up with off balance every single time will result in a couple K extra DPS. Outside of the passives that make the Templar unique, we have a few skills that are specific to this class that change the way we do a basic rotation as well. If you've been thoroughly following this guide, you'd understand that the phrase Power of the Light is an extremely important ability is a gross understatement. This ability not only accounts for nearly 12% of our total DPS output, but it also helps maintain the Illuminate and Prism passes, 2 essential boosts to our damage. Our entire rotation is built around Power of the Light, not only because of its value, but because of its function. Reapplying the skill too early means that we lose both the massive tick of damage that makes up the majority of Podle's DPS, but also messes with our Prism passives timer. So ensuring that we're reapplying this skill the second it runs out, as opposed to even half a second too early or too late, is absolutely essential above 40%. In fact, timer management in general on the Plar is a little different than other classes. The fundamentals are the same. We want to attempt to allow our abilities to fully expire and reapply that ability right when the timer hits 0. It's normally okay to reapply an ability if it has less than a second left of its duration, though this is slightly unoptimal. But on the Templar, it will be a sizable damage loss if we reapply both Power of the Light and Ritual too early. We've discussed Power of the Light, but Ritual's biggest tick of damage is its last one, because it ramps up over time. You only get this tick if you allow the skill to fully expire. Not only that, but Ritual also costs a ton and can really hurt your sustain. So recasting this skill early is extra punishing in that regard as well. Another unique element specific to the Templar is the way that the class weaves. Our primary spammable is a 0.8 second channel, which means 2 things. 1, we cannot bar swap off of this ability, or we end up canceling some of it and therefore lose damage. This means that if we have backbar skills that need reapplied, we need to do so by bar swap canceling skills like Trap, Power of the Light, or Degen. It's very tricky to get your rotation to line up in a way that allows this to happen organically, but it is doable if you follow the rotation outlined in the next section. And for those few moments where it doesn't line up perfectly, it's okay to let your backbar abilities expire for a second or two while you wait for Power of the Light to go off. The second component to this is the unique weaving. When weaving non-channeled abilities, your window of precision is a bit wider when queuing your light attacks. Skills can be cast once every second exactly. In between those skill casts, you can cast a light attack at about 0.5 to 0.6 seconds after the cast of the skill to cue the light attack to fire just before you cast your next ability 1 second later. This is what weaving is in a nutshell. Jabs has a 0.8 second channel though, which means that you have to cue your light attack in a 0.2 second window to get it to fire properly. If you practice weaving this precisely in general, channeled abilities will never throw you off. But if this is your first experience with something like this, welcome to the party. Radiant Oppression weaves a little strangely as well, since it has a 1.8 second channel. I find that if you're using the base UI timers, you can cue your light attack between 0.2 and 0.4 seconds left of Radiant Oppression's duration. So if you react to visually seeing 0.4 left on the timer, and then you hit your light attack, the reaction delay should line up perfectly with the window to queue. Finally, Stampede for some reason requires movement to get the skill to weave normally. A slight wiggle of the thumbstick, a tap of the W key on a keyboard, or simply auto-walking will allow the skill to function normally. The movement needs to be really small though, otherwise you risk losing stacks of Highland Sentinel. One of the final elements in dealing damage on any class is based around actually utilizing your 5-piece sets. It's important to really understand how any set you choose to run works, and to attempt to actively get the most out of it in any content. For our dummy setups, Reliquin requires a solid weave speed and consistency to maximize its damage, as well as awareness of the short duration. It only lasts for 4 seconds, and remember, we can only cast 1 skill per second. So since the set is on the front bar only, spending more than 3 skill casts on the back bar means that our Reliquin stacks will fall off. So make sure that you're never casting too many back bar abilities at one time. Likewise, Highland Sentinel is a really complex set to maximize in content, so much so that the amount of YouTube comments I get spewing about how impossible the set is to maintain would blow your mind. The reality is that with enough practice, experience, and knowledge of a fight, setting yourself up to minimize your movement is very doable in a lot of situations. Obviously, not all of them, which is why we have alternative options. Remember too that losing stacks of Highland Sentinel isn't like losing stacks of Reliquin. Reliquin requires consistent, quick, and precise weaving to rebuild stacks, and Highland Sentinel just requires you to stand still. Beyond that, if you need to move, try to minimize that movement so that you only cut your stacks in half one time. And understand that if you need to continue to move, the penalty becomes less and less severe, and you don't even need all 10 stacks for Highland to be good anyway. 10 becomes 5, and then 5 becomes 3, but then a second passes, so it goes back up to 4, and then you move again, so it goes down to 2, which then goes back up to 3. I mean, it's really hard to get back down to 0. And finally, the big thing that makes the Templar really feel like a unique class. With the skill worth 30% of our DPS output, it's really important to have a strong understanding of how our execute phase works. The timing of this phase is measured out in a few ways. When deciding which skills are no longer worth casting at what percentage point in a fight, we are measuring the total value of a skill compared to the value of our execute ability. Typically, we cast dots in AoEs because of the amount of total damage that they'll do over their entire duration. So a skill like Degeneration, for example, will only do 3.3k damage per second, that is 9.7k per tick, once every 2 seconds, over 22 total seconds. If we let Degeneration get its full duration, it will do up to 106k total damage. One cast of degen equals 106k total damage, assuming that we let it get its full duration. Compare this to our primary spammable jabs, which can end up doing up to 66k damage in one cast, and it's super obvious why these damage over time effects are so valuable. Now let's compare this to Radiant Oppression. This ability will do up to 170k damage in just one tick. It takes 3 times over 2 seconds for a max value of 510k over 2 seconds. Divide this by 2 and that means Radiant Oppression is worth about 250k total damage done in 1 second at some point in this fight. The execute phase attempts to gauge when this becomes applicable, when Radiant Oppression will do more total damage in 1 second than degen will do over its entire duration. So we not only need to factor in the total damage of an ability, but also the damage buffs that it provides. The other major component that we need to measure is how long is left in a fight. If there are only 10 seconds left, for example, then degen is only going to get half its value. It's no longer worth 106k, instead it's only worth 53. So if we can't even get the full duration of a dot or AoE, then surely Radiant Oppression will be a much more valuable cast. The only potential exception to this rule is when an ability can buff Radiant Oppression. Solar Barrage, for example, we still want to cast when we're above 10%, even though if we cast it at, say, 15%, for example, it probably won't get its full duration. However, the benefits from both the damage of the skill, but mainly the buffs it provides to Radiant Oppression, make it worthwhile. So now that we understand the why, let's talk about the execute phase. We start casting Radiant Oppression over jabs at about 42%. Here we need to make a decision about how sweaty we want to get. Degen and Vampire's Bane are both pretty weak dots, but they provide important buffs. We need those buffs throughout the entire parse to make sure that our beam is doing as much damage as possible. However, if we switch from ulti pots to spell power pots or even use spell power potions the entire way through, we no longer need Degen and Vamp Bane for their buffs, and we can stop casting them way earlier when we start beaming. If we switch potions in this kind of way, we will make our last cast of these dots somewhere between 30 and 40%. Our last cast of Ritual should occur between 25 and 30%, but if you're struggling with sustain, you can stop casting this as early as you'd like to when you start beaming. We will make our last cast of Carve and Trap between 10 to 15%, and we will make our last cast of Stampede above 10%. Remember, Radiant Oppression is not a direct damage ability, but we still will proc our weapon damage enchant with Stampede, which will buff our beam, and Stampede itself is a strong short timer on its own. We will make our last cast of Power of the Light above 8%, and finally we should attempt to keep up Solar Barrage for the buff as long as possible, but do not recast this ability below 10%. Now that we understand the core fundamentals of the Templar, we can better understand how the static rotation is designed and how to properly perform the dynamic rotation. But first, let's quickly discuss what pre-buffing these rotations might look like. There are a few really stealthy ways that you can add a couple K to your parse that you might see some players on YouTube doing, but this is by no means necessary and will add less than 2K to your parse. If you're not interested, go ahead and skip ahead to the static rotation. The pre-buff will start for both rotations by activating Vamp Bane and Degeneration on a dummy, so that we get the major spell damage and major spell crit buffs immediately as we begin our parse without having to wait to activate these skills. Then we will head over to our well, where we will activate Radiant Aura for minor intellect and Channeled Focus for the unnamed mag regen. Sustain on the Templar is so bad, but activating these abilities to start will barely allow us to sustain Green Max Mag Food, which will be a little bit stronger than Bystat or Ghastly. I feel that this is perfectly acceptable for dummy parsing, since we have more sources of regen in group content, like Symphony of Blades usually run by the healer, just to name one of many. Finally, we will hit Dawnbreaker, then activate our well, and switch off Radiant Aura and Channeled Focus while the well is channeling. After this, we will begin the pre-buff for both rotations. And with that moving into our static rotation, I built this roto to be very beginner friendly, based on the concepts discussed earlier. But keep in mind that I always recommend using the static roto as a way to familiarize yourself with the class, with the ultimate goal being to work up towards the dynamic rotation. I ended up parsing 130k with some pretty solid crits, which is about 4k less than the 134k that I did with the dynamic version. The dynamic roto had a few small errors though, and good but not spectacular crits, which tells me that it can probably max around 137k, so I would expect this static rotation to parse about 5 to 6k lower. This ended up being roughly an 18 to 19 second rotation that prioritized casting Power of the Light on cooldown. This means we end up overcasting skills like Degen, Trap, Ritual, and Solar Barrage just a little bit, but we will massively overcast Vampire's Bane and undercast Stampede. Overcasting all of these abilities does mean that the mag drain becomes pretty severe, so I did have to use Ghastly Eyeball for the static rotation. Taking a look at the demonstration, remember if you want to add 1 to 2k to your parse, start with the sweaty pre-buff that we discussed earlier, then begin the pre-buff, which goes Shooting Star, Solar Barrage, Stampede, and then we throw our first light attack, signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Power of the Light, Trap, Ritual, Degen, Vampire's Bane, Carve, Power of the Light, Jab 5 times, Power of the Light, Stampede, Carve, Jab 3 times, and then we start the actual rotation that we will repeat until the dummy dies. That rotation goes Power of the Light, Degen, Solar Barrage, Trap, Ritual, Vampire's Bane, Power of the Light, Stampede, Jab 4 times, Power of the Light, Jab 5 times, and repeat. In the most basic iteration of the rotation, you'll only have to track and reapply Carve and Shooting Star dynamically, meaning that you try to reapply Carve right before the timer hits 0, as opposed to casting it at a set time in the rotation. When you do this, try to cast Carve and Shooting Star right after Power of the Light so that you can bar swap off of it in place of a spammable. But if this doesn't line up well, you can simply add it into the rotation whenever. Again, just trying to avoid bar swapping off of jabs by maybe recasting Carve a couple of seconds early if necessary, and also ensuring that you don't cast more than 3 skills at a time on the back bar for Reliquin. Now that said, I was able to squeak out 131k by also playing Vamp Bane dynamically. Using the Vamp Bane slot in the rotation is a dynamic way to reapply Carve, Ult, Vampire's Bane, or Stampede depending on what needed reapplied, and getting a few extra spammables throughout the fight as a result. If you do this, treat Vamp Bane just like Carve in terms of when you reapply it. Whenever we get to 42%, we will start the Xe rotation, which simply turns our Jabs casts into Radiant Oppression casts, using Beam 2 times for the first set of spammables and 3 times for the second set. If you switch from ulti pots to spell power pots, you can use the Xe rotation that drops Vampire's Bane and Degen once you consume the potion for a little bit of extra damage. Otherwise, use the one that includes Vamp Bane and Degen. In any case, once you're under 20%, go through the dot reapplication portion of the rotation one more time, and then just spam beam only until the dummy dies. One final liberty that I took with the 131k semi-static parse was to beam during off-balance procs as the top priority when under 42%. Picking up the rotation as normal wherever I left off when off balance was on cooldown. The only major rules here when you do this are to not let Carve fall off and to cast Dawnbreaker whenever it's ready. And with that, getting into the dynamic rotation, the Plar Roto is pretty straightforward, and the majority of your practice probably will need to be spent on the Exe phase. Parsing on the Plar is largely related to your crit RNG with Power of the Light, jabs, and beam as well, so don't get too discouraged if you're having a hard time hitting top DPS numbers. If you're consistently 2 to 4k away from whatever DPS goal you have, you're probably just waiting on good crits. Ultimately, as with any dynamic rotation, the goal is simply to reapply skills right as they expire, and to use a spammable when nothing needs to be reapplied. This is a little trickier on the Plar as we cannot bar swap off of jabs or beam, so we have to try to plan accordingly. If we run into a situation where skills are about to expire simultaneously, you should follow a priority of reapplication. That is, the most important skills to reapply over others, dependent on either the raw damage of an ability, the penalty for letting one drop, or the buffs that they provide to your overall damage. That priority goes Carve, Power of the Light, Stampede, Solar Barrage, Vampire's Bane, Degeneration, Trap, and Ritual. When using spell power pots, Degen and Vamp Bane move to the back of the order. In this rotation, it's totally okay for Ritual to have a little downtime. In fact, purposefully making Ritual our bottom priority will ensure that we can sustain the entire parse. If you're having too much trouble sustaining with green food, you can switch to Ghastly and expect to lose only 1 to 2k DPS. We also need to remember our priority percentages in Execute, that is where it becomes worth casting Beam as opposed to reapplying a dot. So with that, we will start using Radiant Oppression over Jabs and Dawnbreaker over Shooting Star at 42%. If you switch from ult pots to spell power pots at 42%, you will only reapply Degen and Vamp Bane until you hit your first spell power pot. Otherwise, make your last cast of both of those skills at around 30%. Stop casting Ritual below 25%, but keep up Trap, Carve, Stampede, Solar Barrage, and Power of the Light until about 10%. It's good to have Solar Barrage active for the last 10% if possible, but if you're under that threshold, simply spam Radiant Oppression. So with that, getting into the demonstration, check the beginning of the section to see the Sweaty pre-buff that can add 1 to 2k to your parse if that interests you. Otherwise, we'll begin the pre-buff with Solar Barrage, Shooting Star, and then I like to wait half a second here to let Shooting Star tick again so that I can run up to the dummy and throw Stampede without Solar Barrage pre-pulling. After this, we'll throw our first light attack, signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Power of the Light, Ritual, Trap, Carve, Vampire's Bane, Degen, Power of the Light, Jab 5 times, Power of the Light, Stampede, Carve, Jab 3 times, and then we will simply watch our timers and reapply abilities as they expire, following all the previous rules that we've discussed up to this point. Probably the trickiest part of the Templar rotation is trying to prepare your front bar timers so that you have an ability to bar swap off of whenever a back bar ability needs to be reapplied. There are 2 key moments early on in this parse that I think that we can talk about that might give you a little bit of a better picture of what this looks like. The first of those is right around 87%. We'll bar swap off of Power of the Light to reapply Solar Barrage, but Ritual still has 1 second left. We don't want to reapply Ritual too early for the sake of damage and our Magicka sustain, so we'll bar swap off of Solar Barrage, wait until Trap needs to be reapplied, bar swap off of Trap, and then recast Ritual. Another example of that as we approach 81% with Carve, so you'll notice that when we cast Power of the Light, none of our front bar abilities will need to be reapplied anytime soon, but Carve only has 3 seconds left. Because we'd have to wait another 5 seconds for Power of the Light to expire before we could bar swap again, we reapply Carve early so that it doesn't fall off and we don't lose the stacks of it that we've already built up. You'll notice that Vampire's Bane also had the same amount of time left. Instead of recasting Vampire's Bane early as well, we just wait until Power of the Light needs to be reapplied, only lose 1, maybe 2 seconds of Vampire's Bane, and then recast it. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of the timer dilemma on the Templar. The next most important concept to look at is here at 77%. We get our Shooting Star ready right as the cooldown for Off Balance is about to expire, so we make our cast of Shooting Star as close to 190 as possible, so that when the meteor actually lands, we have 5 seconds of Off Balance left, so that our ultimate is getting the damage buff from Exploiter for as long as possible. And if we continue to cast our ultimate right at 190, or even pay attention to that off-balance cooldown and cast our ultimate right when that off-balance cooldown timer hits 0 or 1, as seen with our next ultimate here at 51%, we're going to ensure that Shooting Star lines up with this damage increase every single time. And perhaps the most important but most complex portion of the Templar's rotation is the Execute phase. We've talked about it a lot, but let's go ahead and look at a walkthrough of it. So right around 42% is when you're going to want to start using Radiant Oppression over Power of the Light. If you're using Green Mag's Mag Food, your Magicka is going to really be hurting by this point. So there are a couple of things that we want to do to try to not only prepare our damage, but also prepare our sustain. If your mag is hurting, you can start casting Radiant Oppression a little bit earlier than 42, but try to start as close to 42 as possible. Somewhere in that first series of beam casts, you want to go ahead and swap over from your ulti pots to your Alliance Spell Power Potions. Radiant Oppression is a 1.8 second channel, so that gives you a lot of time to swap without negatively impacting your weaving in any sort of way. When we start beaming, we also want to keep an eye on that off balance timer. Whenever the off balance cooldown disappears, we want to try to cast as many beams as possible. And we'll see the first example of that right here at about 38%. Now, in a perfect world, we'd be able to hit Power of the Light, beam, and then hit Dawnbreaker when it's ready, only using those 3 abilities throughout this entire off-balance window. However, you'll notice that our Magicka is really, really low. There are a few things that we can do about this. We're trying to buy time to get a shard, so casting stamina-based abilities and maybe reapplying some of our most important ones early is going to relieve a little bit of pressure on our Magicka and allow us to cast Radiant Oppression until we get a shard. So here we'll cast Power of the Light, Bar Swap, and reapply Stampede very early into Flawless Dawnbreaker. All 3 abilities that are not Magicka-based and will now allow us to get another cast of Radiant Oppression off, and that buys us enough time to get a shard, into another Radiant Oppression, into another stamina-based ability. Now, at this point, we have a few seconds left until we get our first Alliance Spell Power Potion, but Degeneration has fallen off, so we will want to cast Degeneration one more time so that we don't lose out on Major Sorcery, but Vampire's Bane has 17 seconds left, which will definitely get a potion back before that needs to be reapplied. So we'll no longer worry about reapplying Vampire's Bane, and as we approach 30% here, we'll also make our last cast of Ritual. We'll be well under 25% by the time Ritual needs applied a second time, so we won't bother casting that anymore either. And now here at 22%, you'll see that we have another off balance proc, so we'll try to hit beam as many times as possible with the buff to Solar Barrage to try to burst up our damage a little bit in this window. And you'll see we gain about 5 or 6k DPS in that period of time. Finally, we are approaching that final 10% threshold, and you'll notice we have a lot of things falling off. So right at 10%, we reapply Power of the Light into a bar swap and cast Stampede for our back bar enchant, followed by Flawless Dawnbreaker. All 3 of those casts happen between 9 to 10%, and that really is the last possible second that you have to get all of this out. Now that we're under 10% though, and our important buff skills have been reapplied, we're only going to use Radiant Oppression until the dummy dies, and our damage is going to burst up like crazy as a result. While I maintain that the 21 mil is a great place to practice and learn about a class and its unique damage, content demands that you make some slight adaptations to the pure single target rotation in order to maximize the damage that you do in PvE encounters. For example, while this rotation is great for long single target fights like the bosses in VKA or in Sunspire, this rotation will not be the absolute most optimal way to go about burst-oriented fights, especially AoE burst situations like trash pulls. In general, this rotation can be adapted to 2 main situations: single target and AoE burst. Single target burst fights encompass entire boss fights or boss phases where it would not be worth reapplying any more dots or AoEs. In general, spammable damage accounts for over 30% of our overall DPS output in a single target situation. That is, skills like jabs and Radiant Oppression. The only thing that makes dropping skills like dots and AoEs worthwhile is the total damage that they deal. As a quick refresher, for example, our primary spammable Puncturing Sweep can hit for up to 66k in one cast. Compare this to one of the dots in our toolkit, Degen, which lasts for 22 seconds, ticking once every 2 seconds, at a max hit of 9.7k. It will tick for this value 11 total times over its duration, resulting in a max value of up to 106k total damage done. So as long as we can wait 22 seconds, one cast of Degen will do more than one cast of our spammable. And this concept demonstrates why we run dots and AoEs in our setup at all. This is also the same reason that we don't want to reapply dots early. If we do, we miss ticks of the ability that could have otherwise been spent on our spammable and therefore lose damage. Now let's apply this concept within the context of a burst situation. If you can only damage a boss for 10 more seconds, we only get half the amount of ticks of a skill like Degen, resulting in about 53k total damage done in this window. However, if we cast jabs, we can get 66k in that same cast window. As you can see, it becomes worth letting this dot fall off in favor of casting our spammable in this situation. And that goes tenfold if we're comparing this dot to an ability like Radiant Oppression, which can do up to 255k a second in Exe. So when is this concept applicable? As a general rule, a single target burst phase encompasses about a 5 to 10 second window that you have to do damage before you can't damage the boss anymore. This happens on every single boss fight. For example, if a boss is under 10 million HP, this means that there are about 10 seconds or less left until the boss is dead, indicating a burst phase. If a boss is 1 or 2 mechanics away until it goes into a mechanic where they are invulnerable, this indicates a burst phase. An example might be Zalvaka before she ports, the dragons in Sunspire before they fly into the air, or Lilanar and Turlesil before they do their interrupt mechanic. If a boss has short damage phases that are a part of the fight structure, like Olms and Asylum Sanctorum, these are also burst phases. Finally, bosses with little to no health, like the spider in VHOF or the snake in VRG, are fights short enough to be considered full-on burst fights, which would still imply that it wouldn't be worth reapplying any dots or AoEs once cast. As a general rule, if you cannot get at least half the duration of your dot or AoE, it's not worth reapplying. There are some gives and takes to this, but you can use this rule while you're starting to play around with this concept and fine-tune it fight to fight. Once you are familiar enough with a fight, you can gauge when that value will be applicable. For example, it will be worth reapplying a couple of dots just before you hit a burst window a little early if they are going to expire soon. But if that window is open, you're kind of stuck with what you gave yourself in terms of preparation. For this example, assume that we are on a fight like Zalvaka. In this fight, she'll usually do 3 mechanics on the first floor before the first port. If you didn't reapply some dots a little early in preparation for Mech 3 by the time it comes along, you're best off just spamming and taking the L with what damage could have been. However, if you anticipate this and reapply any skills that will fall off during that burst phase 1 or 2 seconds early and then spam only when that phase happens, you maximize your damage. And with that, the biggest mistake I see players make revolves around how they conduct their trash damage. Each and every trash fight in the game is a burst type of fight. The adds usually have anywhere from 2 to 4 million health apiece for high priority targets. Divide that by 8 damage dealers, and that's at most about 500,000 damage that you need to do to a target each. Quick math says that your spammable will get you there far faster than any dot or AoE. Again, in this toolkit, you have to wait 22 seconds to get 106k damage out of a skill like Degen, as opposed to waiting only 2 seconds to get 120k out of jabs. Why use that dot in the middle of a trash pull if your spammable will get you 120k damage in 2 seconds? The key to maximizing damage in trash is by pre-buffing, casting skills between pulls and out of combat. Our entire trash setup is built around this concept. Between trash pulls, we want to be casting skills like Cloak, Race Against Time, Proxy Debt, and even our Destro ult right before a pull starts. But when the fight does start, we only want to cast Wall, Caltrops, and then use our spammables. If done correctly, we should be able to only use our spammables until the pull is finished, without losing much if any of the duration of any of the dots we pre-buffed with. If everyone in your group performs trash like this, especially with an AoE spammable equipped, your group's trash damage will increase tremendously. Thank you so much, everybody, for checking out the video. As always, if you found the video helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I pride myself on responding to every single comment, so feel free to test me on that statement. Be sure to join the Discord to get the full written guide to this build. The written guide is over 40 pages of information, most of which is in this video. But it is an easy way to control F your way to any specific topic that you might not feel super comfy on after watching. Likewise, I'm on Twitch, Twitter, and Patreon as well, so be sure to check out those platforms and shoot me a follow. And if you've made it this far, you know that this video just looks spectacular. You have the one and only Artea to thank for that. A huge shout out and thank you to her. Go show her some love on YouTube. She makes some spectacular content. Another special thanks to all of my current Patreons and YouTube members: Patrick, Thyme, Rain, Joseph, Darren, Vic, Tyler, Joshua, Larry, Robert, Clyde, and Nick. Thank you so much for your support and for making this video possible. I couldn't do it without you, so seriously, thank you. And thanks to all of you as well for all of your love and support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next one. You want to see my feet? Bro, donate 20 subs and I'll put my feet in the camera right now. Don't test me. There is no way, dude. There's no shot.